Hello and welcome to Byline Radio with me, Adrian Goldberg. Today, Priti Patel, and a rare defeat for the hostile environment. The Home Secretary has been told that the confiscation of asylum seekers' phones is illegal. It is a rare setback for a government that has been seeking to tighten the screw on those fleeing persecution and poverty, as exemplified by the Nationality and Borders Bill currently being piloted through Parliament. Despite a rebellion in the House of Lords, MPs voted last week to restore measures in the bill that include plans to process asylum seekers offshore and impose lengthy prison sentences on all those who arrive in the UK through an unsanctioned route, even if they have risked their lives crossing the Channel in a small boat. It is all part of a hostile environment initiated in 2007 by the then Immigration Minister Liam Byrne, who was part of the new Labour government that introduced fines for bosses who hired employees who couldn't prove they had a right to work in the UK. The coalition government from 2010 ramped up the pressure on undocumented migrants, and now we have the current bill. But there has been a defeat for Boris Johnson's government over the seizure of asylum seekers' phones. We'll be hearing from Katie Tarrant shortly. She broke the original story about asylum seekers' phones being seized on the Byline Times. And the Byline Times chief investigations reporter Sam Bright will also join us as well to explain the broader context. And I'm keen to explore this evening what this story tells us about how we treat asylum seekers and refugees in the UK, especially at this moment as we're dealing with the fallout from Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Before we get cracking, though, just a reminder that Byline Radio comes from the Byline Times, and we don't have any corporate backer to support us. There's no proprietor writing the cheques. Essentially, we rely on people like you to fund us. And the good thing about that is that because we aren't in hock to anybody else, we can report without fear or favour. So if you want to support what we do, please take out a subscription to the Byline Times. You'll get a fantastic monthly newspaper, but you'll also be supporting this enterprise, Byline Radio. You'll also be supporting the Byline Times podcast, where you might be enjoying this show again on Catch Up, or indeed you might be helping to support our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's where you'll find details of how to subscribe on that website at bylinetimes.com. And we'd also welcome your contributions as well. This evening, if you're listening live on Byline Radio, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, if you're on the phone anyway, I don't think this works on laptops or Macs or PCs, but if you're listening on your phone, in the bottom left-hand corner, you should have a little microphone icon. If you tap that, then you can join us. All you have to do is request access to the microphone, tap it, and then if I like the cut of your jib, I'll let you on. And as long as you've got something intelligent or sensible to say or a question to ask, we'll be very keen to let you join in. Obviously, if you're listening via the Byline Times podcast on Catch Up, you can't do that, but you can always send me an email after the event, as it were, to goldbergradio@gmail.com. That's goldbergradio@gmail.com. Let's catch up first then with Katie Tarrant. Now, she wrote the original story in the Byline Times, and this goes back a fair way now, about asylum seekers having their mobile phones seized by border control. Katie, welcome along to Byline Radio. Your debut. Good to have you with us. You're right.
Hi, Adrian. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Lovely. Well done, by the way. This was a cracking story. Just tell us how you came about the story and what it said.
Well, I mean, the story actually developed very naturally, which is unusual. But essentially, I came across a contract between the Home Office and a provider of data extraction kiosks called MSAB. A data extraction kiosk is what Border Force and other police and stuff can use to extract data from mobile phones. And, you know, this was in 2020, and I wasn't aware that that Border Force were using such technology. So I sent a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office to ask how many times this technology had been used, what was it being used for, and then kind of started doing my own research. So So I was asking around refugee charities and organisations to see if anyone had heard of this technology being used. Were the Home Office taking away phones? And why was it a contract that was in place? And nobody seemed to know anything about it until I came across just your average kind of charity volunteer at Care for Calais, who had been keeping a record of the amount of refugees that she had helped after they'd had their phone taken by the Home Office. And at that point, it was nearly 100 phones. And, I was astounded by this, that, this one charity volunteer had come across this happening in so many different circumstances. And as it transpired, when my FOI came back, the Home Office had actually been enacting this policy whereby almost every migrant that crossed the Channel in 2020 had their phone taken.
You say it wasn't just about taking the phone from them. This was about data extraction. So what kind of information were border officials getting from these phones?
Well, they, funnily enough, would not answer that question directly. But what you can assume from what these data kiosks allow users to do is you can download all of the messages, photos, any kind of documents. So if, a refugee had their passport uploaded to their phone or anything like that, emails, basically, imagine your entire life is on your phone, and that is what the Home Office had access to. And when they did give me a response, they said that they were using this technology to tackle organised crime groups. But what they didn't say they were doing, and what it turns out they weren't doing, it was distinguishing between people who they had a legitimate reason to be concerned were part of an organised crime group and your average person coming across in a boat. So essentially, as we've seen in policy since, they were treating every single person crossing the Channel as a potential criminal.
Yeah, I suppose it's the equivalent, isn't it, of stop and search without good reason. There might be occasions when officials might think, that person might well have connections with the criminal underworld or might be a human trafficker. We need to be establishing the reality of that suspicion versus just indiscriminately scraping information from everybody who's arriving in the UK or indeed arriving in northern France and seeking access to the UK.
Exactly. And the thing about it was, one of their defences was that they issued a receipt when they were taking the phone for extraction. The way they presented it was like, this gives, the person has the opportunity to decline to give the phone to the Home Office. We're not pressuring anyone to do this. But actually, when we saw a copy of the documents given to asylum seekers when their phones were taken away, it said, you are lawfully required to now provide the officer seizing the phone with the PIN and security code which unlocks it. It is an offence not to provide these details. And so what, institutions like Privacy International, when we spoke to them about our findings here, said was that it is not consent if you're coerced into doing it or you're told that you're going to be arrested if you don't hand over your phone. And the fact of the matter is, when I was speaking to this one volunteer, she'd been campaigning for almost a year to get some of the phones back that had been taken. So people who had crossed, as you say, from France, and they were deprived of any means of contacting a lawyer, of contacting their family to tell them that they were safe, and some of them still haven't got it back.
Could there be an argument here, Katie, that the Home Office ultimately has a responsibility to protect every man, woman and child in this country, and that those phones might potentially have contained information about people who were smuggling human beings into this country and were doing so in a way that potentially, anyway, could have been harmful to this country?
I think it's incredibly important for the Home Office to take measures to tackle organised crime, because, at the end of the day, some of these people coming over are being exploited by said criminals as well. But the fact of the matter is, any kind of measure doing that needs to be proportionate. And what the court case against the Home Office that concluded a few days ago that Priti Patel's actions were unlawful said was that this was not a proportionate response. A child coming across that has a mobile phone, I think, in some cases you can probably assume they're not part of the organised crime network, and depriving them of that phone is actually going to do them a lot of harm. So I think it's all about proportionality.
And your original article was in August 2021, so 7 months ago. How did the case come to court?
So it took a while to come to court because the Home Office at the time, and at the time of us publishing this article, were still, denying to the lawyers that this was even taking place. And so what happened is in January, they started the court hearing, and there was an initial admission from one of the Home Office's lawyers that they might have acted unlawfully and that a secret policy may have taken place. And then that has only got stronger as the case has gone on. And, it's been really interesting to see that it was 3 asylum seekers that actually brought the case against the Home Office. And it has been, heartbreaking to hear their experiences, and the fact that other people that have tried to get their phones back, calls, they were given a phone number apparently to get their phones back, and these were not answered. The email that was set up to respond to people asking for their phones back didn't receive responses. It's what we've seen in similar cases when the Home Office said that they would be bringing over people from Afghanistan that needed safe housing in the UK, and they didn't answer their emails then either. So I think, as I say, the case has developed over the last few months, but what it's shown is a lot of similarities to other cases where asylum seekers have been mistreated in the UK.
And as you say, for most people these days, their life is on their phone, and their contacts, their photos, especially if you've travelled thousands of miles in pursuit of a safe haven. I don't know if you can shed any light on those stories from the asylum seekers that were heard in court. But in any event, the fact that the phones were not returned to people for many months meant that effectively, over and above the scraping of their data, they were being denied the opportunity perhaps to stay in touch with loved ones and children or parents or whatever.
Well, it's exactly as you say. A couple of asylum seekers that I did speak to for the article were saying actually it was the photos and things like that. They've travelled from Iran, from Eritrea, from Syria, and that phone was the only thing they had to look at any memories of times with family, and that creates such a sense of hopelessness and not to be able to contact the people that you love for so long. And again, as I said, it actually was an impediment to some people's asylum claims because the documents that they needed were on the phones and they couldn't get the phones back. It was just such a vicious cycle of people's pain being extended over a longer period of time just because officials, couldn't find the phones. In some cases, actually, some people alleged that the Home Office had lost their phones, or they were saying that they needed it for a longer period of time.
Following the court ruling now, Priti Patel has had to acknowledge that this was this blanket policy, that particular part of it, the fact that it was applied apparently to everyone going through a particular port, that was wrong and they cannot continue with this policy.
And I think that felt very, very far away and not a likely possibility when we were first investigating this, because the Home Office put up such a fight, even, with the lawyers denying that this was not happening. When I actually sent this FOI, it was only 23 days after that request that they actually published that they kind of what it seemed like they had done is hastily got together a document that suggested there was a kind of policy in place to make it look even more legitimate. And then now they've said even that policy was unlawful. And so, I mean, I guess my question now would be what kind of, if this was unlawful and people's human rights were breached, what kind of justice are they going to see now?
I know that you've popped out of work to bring us up to date on this story. Please stay with us for as long as you can, Katie, but I know that you might have to disappear as well. But if you want to ask Katie a question about the story while she's still here with us, by all means do so. If you've got a comment to make and you're listening live to @Byline Radio on the phone, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little microphone icon. Tap that. That tells me that you want to talk, and I'll grant you permission to talk if you've got something sensible to say. And we're going to be talking more about the context of this as well with Sam Bright from Byline Times. Really keen to hear what you make of it, though, and what it tells us about Britain's attitude towards people who are fleeing persecution or poverty. Sometimes a distinction is drawn between those who are in fear of their lives during war or those who are simply seeking a better life for themselves, as if that were a trivial or unimportant thing. But in any event, I'd welcome your comments. If you're listening live, that's great. If you're not listening live, if you're listening via the Byline Times podcast, well, you can still drop me a comment and I might reflect it in a future episode of the podcast or put it up on the Twitter feed. Send me an email to goldbergradio@gmail.com. And just to remind you, my name's Adrian Goldberg and you're listening to Byline Radio from the Byline Times, independent, fearless journalism. We make a brilliant monthly newspaper. And if you subscribe to that, and it only costs £39 a year, well, you'll be supporting honest, fearless journalism and helping to support Byline Radio, the Byline Times podcast, and Byline TV as well. Find out more about subscribing at bylinetimes.com, our newsbreaking website. That's at bylinetimes.com. Sam Bright is with us as well. As I mentioned, he's the chief investigations reporter for the Byline Times. And Sam, as I said in my introduction, this is a rare defeat for a government which seems to determined to tighten the screw day by day on migrants arriving in the UK. Unless they're from Ukraine, of course.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you say rare, but it's had a few defeats in recent years over the hostile environment, even if it's just PR defeats. So obviously the hostile environment being revealed initially was a major defeat for the government and for the Conservative Party as a whole. But I think it's just so relentless in trying to force through this agenda that those moments outshine really the defeats that it suffers. I mean, Katie called it a vicious cycle that these asylum seekers have to go through, and I think the people who are imposing that, who are being the vicious part of the vicious cycle, are the Home Office, because this has been a concerted policy over many years. And we talk about the government breaking the law. I remember investigating back in 2015, 2016, the fact that asylum seekers had been paid out millions of pounds every year because they were unlawfully housed in immigration detention facilities. And 7 years later, asylum seekers are still being paid millions of pounds a year because they're being unlawfully held in immigration detention facilities. It's a case of the government not learning from repeated failures and an onslaught from the public, saying, from many voters among us, that this isn't what they want to see from a modern progressive government. And they could continue in any way.
Sorry, Sam, to cut across you, but I mean, you talk about the Conservatives. This is a quote. What we are proposing here will, I think, flush illegal migrants out. We are trying to create a much more hostile environment in this country if you are here illegally. We have to make Britain much less of an attractive place if you're going to come here and break the rules. That wasn't a Conservative minister speaking. That was a Labour minister speaking. That was Liam Byrne back in 2007 when he was a new Labour minister, when he introduced £10,000 fines for employers who hired workers who didn't have the correct documentation. So the concept of a hostile environment, it may well have been amplified, particularly by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. Sam, it's interesting to me that the House of Lords has seemed to push back at what are regarded as some of the more extreme measures of the Nationality and Borders Bill. And there was some speculation last week in Parliament that MPs might go with the Lords, or at least there might be a substantial Conservative backbench rebellion in order to overturn the government's plans to process migrants overseas, to criminalise those who arrive via unsanctioned routes. But despite lots of rumours, lots of huffle-puffle in the media, it never came to pass, and those clauses have been restored to the Nationality and Borders Bill.
Yeah, exactly. And this seems to be a bit of a war that's going on in the Conservative Party at the minute, whether it should adhere to Priti Patel's approach to immigration and asylum, or whether she should be booted out of cabinet entirely. For the minute, they're sticking with it, and it strikes me that they've gone too far down the path, down Priti Patel's path to reverse now and show a more dignified approach to asylum seekers. But yeah, especially with Boris Johnson's 80-seat majority, he can essentially force through, if he's in support of the measures, which he seems to be, he can essentially force through whatever he wants. And Priti Patel's been a close ally of his, so he's going to stick with it. One thing that I found quite interesting, Adrian, because you might think that someone who's pursuing quite hardline policies, quite right-wing policies, might go down well among the Conservative grassroots. We've seen that with Liz Truss. She's been very popular among Conservative Party members. But I was looking back through Conservative Home, the website. It polls members on the most popular cabinet ministers. And Priti Patel was the second least popular cabinet minister in February and the fourth least popular in January. So even despite these pretty hardline views, she's not even appealing to the Conservative Party grassroots, which makes you think, why exactly is she doing this? She's definitely not benefiting personally, politically from it. So it's baffling to me that she would pursue this so hard.
There is another strand of the Conservative Party, though, and I've mentioned the talk of a backbench rebellion last week. Never came to pass in any significant numbers, but there have been a number of Conservative MPs, including the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, including the now Health Secretary Sajid Javid, including the former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell, who have all, at one time or another, lobbied for the right of asylum seekers to be allowed to work while their claims are processed. And they argue that that would be good for the country because those asylum seekers would not have to be supported to the extent that they are. It would also be good for the asylum seekers. At the moment, you can't work if you're an asylum seeker unless you are in the country for 12 months and your claim has not been processed through no fault of your own. So, there are, as so often in these cases, the people who claim to hate bureaucracy and red tape, but all sorts of hurdles in the way of people who arrive in this country, but people who may well have skills to offer. And as part of that, I just also observed, Sam, that, the phrase illegal immigrant is often used. At the point at which people are seeking asylum, before the Nationality and Borders Bill becomes law anyway, they are not illegal asylum seekers. You can't be, at that point, illegal because your case has not been assessed. The validity of your claim has not been assessed at that point.
No, exactly. There's no such thing, like you say, as an illegal asylum seeker. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty shocking, to be honest. I think it's drawn out in the fact that Ukrainian refugees who are allowed in through the family scheme, so the community scheme, whereby people can put a Ukrainian refugee up in their home. those Ukrainians are allowed the right to work, thus undermining the Home Office's policy for decades now of not allowing other asylum seekers to work, which is pretty shocking. I do wonder whether the Ukraine situation will cause some thawing of the government's approach to asylum, or whether a new wave of asylum seekers coming across the channel and Nigel Farage banging on GB News will cause them to retrench to the barracks once again. And I mean, some of the details of the Nationality and Borders Bill are pretty shocking. As you've mentioned, sending asylum seekers to foreign islands in order to be processed, deploying the Royal Navy. There's some suggestion that wave machines might be used to repel asylum seekers coming across the channel. And it's been highlighted rightly by Labour and others that Ukrainians might be on these boats in the not too distant future. Because, I mean, it's ludicrous, the idea of criminalising somebody on the basis of how they get to this country, when these are people, if not fleeing Putin's bombs, if not fleeing Putin's bombs in Ukraine, then fleeing Putin's bombs in Syria and Assad's chemical weapons. And to think that you can tightly organise your route to the UK and find a legal route, which, by the way, haven't really been offered by the UK government prior to these Ukrainian schemes, and in these cases, very incompetently. It's just, the whole idea is ludicrous if we put ourselves in the position of these asylum seekers for even a moment.
Yeah, our contributors on previous episodes of Byline Radio and on Byline Times podcast have made the point that the people fleeing Putin's bombs in Ukraine are almost deliberately, it seems, being placed outside the normal UK refugee system. The fact that you can apply for a visa, for example, certainly the first tranche of refugees were being dealt with through a more conventional immigration route or almost a holiday route, because it's a visa rather than the conventional asylum seeking system, almost as though a distinction was being made between those people fleeing persecution, as you say, the people fleeing Putin's bombs in Kyiv or Mariupol were being treated differently to those fleeing Putin's bombs in Syria. And the fact that it was the Michael Gove's department, the Department for Communities and Levelling Up, that was dealing with Ukrainian refugees rather than the Home Office, as though the Home Office doesn't want to be tarnished by actually seeking to help people who are in fear for their lives.
Well, I do think it's fascinating. I think the distinction or not between asylum seekers and immigrants, because if you think about it, Ukraine in this current situation and through the visa route sort of signifies migration from the Western world. It seemed as though during the Brexit debate that, to put it frankly, white immigrants or those from more developed countries were fine, but people who weren't white are not okay. And yet it was through Brexit that immigration rather than asylum was being clamped down on. So the very people who Zelensky and the Ukrainians want to join in the EU, we were in essence, we were trying to reduce those numbers of people. And yet, the Brexit debate, I think, might have relied quite heavily on the Syrian refugee crisis, which obviously, as we know, occurred sort of 2014, 2015, in the immediate run-up to the referendum, where people saw millions of people going to Germany, a series of, terrorist incidents that were completely unrelated, but, they associated brown faces with both these occurrences, and therefore sought to clamp down on those people coming to the UK. Whereas in actual fact, what they did was end up clamping down on Ukrainians and people in the Western world, and I think it just shows the irony of the debate and the lack of understanding and nuance from those who were propagating these sort of myths, willful misunderstanding of the myths. I think they were fully aware of what they were doing, but they wanted to lead the public down the garden path regardless.
If you do want to join in, now is the moment. If you're listening live on Byline Radio, in the bottom left hand of your screen, there is a microphone icon. Tap that. That will request access to speak. And when I say that, I'll give you access to speak to us for as long as you can entertain or inform us. Otherwise, Sam and I will maybe nip down the pub. I don't know. It's entirely up to you. But just to say as well, and you do need a note, or you may need to get off, Sam, I don't know, but it's entirely up to you. This has been fascinating insight. One final question I'm going to ask you, because I will let you go. And it's really about the Labour Party. I say they initiated in some form. I'm not saying that Labour are responsible for where we are now, but New Labour, for reasons that were calculated to appeal to the electorate, went down the route of creating this hostile environment in the first place. And there's no question that Theresa May, first in the coalition government, and now Priti Patel as Home Secretary, have seriously turned up the heat on that hostile environment. But for the reasons that Labour introduced it in the first place, perhaps they are fearful of speaking out on this. And that's one of the reasons that there hasn't been that much vocal opposition to the Nationality and Borders Bill, or at least vocal opposition that has really cut through. Labour have not made this a platform on which they seek to oppose the government strongly. And behind that lies, I think, perhaps an understandable but also quite a cynical electoral calculation, one equivalent to that which Liam Byrne exercised all those years back in 2007.
Yeah, and I'd like to couch what I say next in the fact that I'm not endorsing what Labour has said and done on this issue, but just merely trying to explain it. I think you're entirely right. It is a strategic political move, and I think what they're betting on in particular now is that views of immigration and asylum are caught up very directly with Brexit. And they are the top issues of concern to Brexit voters, particularly older white Brexit voters that reside in the Red Wall. As we famously know now, dozens of Red Wall seats fell from Labour to the Tories at the last election, and Labour needs to get them back. And so even if it doesn't directly appeal in the same way that the Conservatives does, and say bigoted things about immigration, it's certainly trying its best not to push away those voters and to really push their buttons in such a way that it drives them back into the Conservative Party's hands at the next election. And you might say, what's the point of the Labour Party if it doesn't stand for progressive ideas and doesn't call out the Conservative Party on these issues? And if you're Keir Starmer, you might say, well, if the Conservatives keep getting in power, then in perpetuity they're going to be able to institute these sorts of laws that will criminalise asylum seekers and immigrants. And what matters is winning the election, and then you can judge our values. And I think both views have merit. To be honest, I have sympathy with both of them. But I think that's pretty much where the Labour Party is coming from at the minute.
Sam, thanks for your time tonight. Sam Bright, Chief Investigations Reporter of Byline Times. You've been listening to Byline Radio, or you might be listening again on Catch Up via the Byline Times podcast. Either way, we're very grateful to your company and very grateful for your support. This is Byline Radio coming to you from the Byline Times. If you want to support free, independent journalism in the UK and beyond, please consider taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. Nobody owns us. Nobody tells us what to say. We are not party political. We're just trying to tell the truth as our journalists see it. So do think about taking out a subscription. It helps fund Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast. Get more details on our website at bylinetimes.com. That has loads of great news-breaking stories, fresh every day. That's also where you'll find details of how to subscribe at bylinetimes.com. Thanks very much indeed for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Keep an eye on the Byline Times Twitter feed. That's where we advertise when we're going to go live with these spaces. And we'll see you again, as I say, shortly. Thanks very much indeed for listening.